Welcome to the very first episode of the Conscious Creative series. We are here to discuss science and spirituality and the deeper understanding of our creativity, how we can tap into a higher consciousness to enhance our creativity. So I'm here with Dr. Zapatera. I am so excited about this conversation. I have so many questions for you, but what I'd like to do in the beginning, before we really jump in, I saw on a podcast that you had done that you did an intention setting, which I loved. I thought was so powerful. I just want to set an intention for this call, this series, this episode. For me, the intention is to teach other creative people as well as learn for myself. How do we tap in? How do we use science to understand ourselves on a deeper level so that when we're creating, whether it's art or music or life or everything in general, how do we do that in a more strategic way that we're understanding our body so we're really getting the most out of this human experience? So that for me is my intention for us today. Do you have an intention you want to share with us?
Just to be able to support you in your intention as best as possible, and to allow this conscious creative to really manifest itself as you dream.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to just read a little bit of your bio because I want to get it right. Dr. Zapatera attained his MD and PhD from Harvard Medical School. He is board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation with a focus on optimizing human performance, increasing awareness, and decreasing suffering. He has written all sorts of books, children's books, chapter books, things like that. All of those are going to be linked in the description of this. And he continues to create programs to help patients with chronic pain and investigate the cerebral spinal fluid and integrate new research to evolve the hypnothesis of cerebral spinal fluid and I am. I love that. And I think what really draws me to your work, I love the marriage of science and spirituality. I love that we're going into this space of there's not so much of a separation, but they're working together, and it's so much more powerful. I think understanding the science side of it and understanding the spiritual side of it just offers us such a next level approach.
Absolutely. You're spot on.
I'd like to start the conversation with, if you can just explain to us on a very kind of condensed level, if that's possible, about the cerebral spinal fluid. What is it? Is the first question.
Yeah, the first is just looking at the word cerebrospinal fluid. So it is a fluid. It's made of mainly water, and it's in the cerebral, the brain and the spine in essence, and it's bathing the brain and the spine. So many people aren't aware of this fluid. And in fact, when I started studying it, we didn't really know what its function was. We thought that it was just creating a buoyancy for the brain. So if you could imagine, right, in the middle of your brain, you have these cavities. They're holes. They're called ventricles, and in those ventricles is like a lake of fluid. So there's fluid in the ventricles of our brain, in the cavities of our brain. We all have these ventricles, and there's a central canal. So the brain is connected to the spinal cord, and there's a central canal in the spinal cord that goes. It's actually on the inside. So if you can imagine the inside of like the hole of a donut, that's what the spinal cord is. And so the inside of that donut has fluid. So the inside of the spinal cord has fluid that goes all the way down it. So it bathes the inside of our brain, like literally the inside cavities of our brain. Then there's the tissue, and then it bathes the outside of our brain. And then there's the skull. And so it bathes the inside of the spinal cord and the outside of the spinal cord. And it goes all the way down to the sacrum. So right now, when we're sitting on our sacrums, you're essentially sitting on a pool of fluid down there. The spinal cord ends at what we call lumbar vertebrae 2, but the cerebrospinal fluid goes all the way down into the sacrum. And so there's a continuation of this fluid down into the sacrum. And so if you just look at it anatomically, you see this fluid, you think that, it's providing just a support system, the brain and the spinal cord. And so the brain and the spinal cord are buoyant in this fluid. And they are. There's no doubt about that. People thought initially that it was providing just some basic nutrients. The brain had to be in a fluid environment. It had to stay moist, let's say, and that if you got hit in the head, that you'd have this fluid sort of buffer that the brain would actually go up against first.
Okay.
And it does create a buoyancy. Anytime you go into water, the weight decreases. And so if an adult human brain weighs anywhere, let's approximate 1,500 grams, right? So 1,500 grams. In the buoyancy of the cerebrospinal fluid, it comes down to about 25 or 50 grams. So it's significantly less weight. If I took it out of the fluid, now I'm holding 1,500 grams. And so that's essentially what the fluid is. It's a fluid that is bathing the inside of our brain, the outside of our brain, the inside of our spinal cord, and the outside of our spinal cord.
Is the fluid, so this is the lake, this is the way I'm like imagining it when I'm listening to your research, this is maybe the lake or the ocean, and then this is the river, like our spine.
Totally.
Okay. And then does it go back up to the brain?
Yeah, so imagine it like a circuit.
Okay.
In some way. So there's constant movement of the fluid. Obviously, just based on our movements, there's movement of the fluid. There's a lot of research that has really opened up in the last decade or so that has shown that this fluid is very dynamic. And so at first, what we thought was the fluid is made by the choroid plexus, which is this tissue essentially in the brain, and then it gets absorbed by the brain, and it's just like it gets made and absorbed, and there's just constant making and absorption, and that's about it. And what some research over the last 10 years has really shown is that it's really much more dynamic than that. And that's the sense that you get from when you tap into the fluid. It's a very dynamic fluid. And so it's great that the research was showing that, because people were having experiences of the fluid, and yet we didn't have the research that showed what the fluid was actually doing. And now we do. And so the fluid is very dynamic, so it moves. So imagine some of the research that has been shown has shown that, for instance, during sleep, the brain tissue actually opens up. It's called the lymphatic system. It opens up, and the fluid actually is no longer housed in the ventricles. It actually goes through the brain itself and helps clean out toxins that build up just throughout the day from normal brain use. And so we never had an understanding of that. We always just thought that it was in the ventricles, and then it'd come outside the brain and get reabsorbed, and then it'd go back into your blood. Now we have a better understanding of this fluid is very dynamic. It's not only in the ventricles, but under certain states, it actually goes through the brain. It cleans out the toxins, and then it gets resorbed, and it goes back to the blood supply. And so the first thing that they saw was that actually this fluid is moving quite a bit during sleep. That during sleep, like I said, the brain tissue itself actually opens up. So if you can imagine, you mentioned a river and an ocean, or the sea or the lake, right? There's these lakes, there's these oceans, but then there's these tributaries through the brain that open up during certain states. And the first state was sleep that they were able to figure out. And then people started looking at, oh wow, this is very dynamic. During states of sleep, there's a slowing of a very rhythmic pattern that occurs. There's a slowing of neuronal activity during sleep. There's a relative rush of blood out of the brain. And as the blood rushes out of the brain, there's a pulsing nature of the cerebrospinal fluid into the brain, actually into the ventricle, into those cavities, and then from those cavities into the brain tissue itself. So imagine this sort of pulsatile nature, slowing of your brain waves, right? You're asleep, slowing of your brain waves, relative decrease of blood, and then this pulsing of the cerebrospinal fluid up into the ventricles, up into the main ventricles throughout the brain. And then what they looked at is actually they looked at everywhere throughout the spinal cord. And what they saw was that it wasn't just sleep that was affecting this movement. It was also things like our breath, our heart rate was affecting the movement. They've now looked at strobe lights or activating the visual cortex can affect this movement. They've looked at ultrasound, so directed energy. Let's just take it as directed energy, whether it's a light, a flashing light, or an ultrasound wave to the brain, to the actual area of the cerebrospinal fluid, can get this to move. And some of the cool research has shown that all the way from the sacrum, from the lower lumbar vertebrae, when we take an in-breath, for instance, we are bringing the cerebrospinal fluid up into, we're moving it towards the brain. Okay. And they've actually shown some really cool research of a big in-breath, inhale, actually seeing pulsations into the main ventricle, which is the third ventricle in the middle of our brain. And then with an exhale, the fluid moves down towards the sacrum. So inhale, you're bringing it up. Exhale, you're pushing it down towards the sacrum. Inhale, you're bringing it up. And you can already see how this then ties into a lot of breath work practices in terms of, if you do consider it a river, right? It's good for rivers to flow. Usually. It's good for there to be no stagnation, for fluid to be dynamic. And so when they looked at sleep, they said, wow, this is actually one of the first times that we figured out why sleep is important. Because when we sleep, we open up these tributaries in the brain, and this fluid comes through the brain and it cleans out all the toxins. And so you want that fluid to move. Now, because of that, there's theories that are proposed that says, hey, if this fluid isn't moving, then toxins are building up, and maybe we're actually predisposing ourselves to inflammatory conditions like Alzheimer's, dementia, even things like stroke or depression. And so we want this fluid to move. There's a lot of clinical studies going on right now trying to stimulate this fluid to move and see, can we improve things like concussion, post-stroke injuries, headaches, chronic pain, dementia, or mild cognitive impairment. And so just thinking of it as, how do we get this fluid to move, and what's the nature of the movement, and how do we keep this river and lake bathed and flowing and moving and healthy and vibrant and all those sorts of things. That's where the research is at and where it's going.
So is the cerebral spinal fluid, is its sole purpose to really give us a good rinse every day? Or is it actually carrying information along the river to say, okay, stop at the heart, you need this and this. Okay, stop at all the different chakras. Like, is it delivering mail to each different post office and then coming back? Or is it just rinsing, taking all the toxins all out?
Yeah, that's a great question. That goes a little bit into kind of the energetics of the cerebrospinal fluid. The reason you're asking that question is probably because you've had some experience that may be telling you, that may actually be giving you information already. Okay. So there's no like scientific research yet that from an energetic perspective, that's what it's doing. But let's break it down. Yeah. All right. We already know over the last, since I did my PhD on this, we started understanding that the fluid is much more dynamic than what we thought it was. At first, it was just, okay, here's this fluid. Studying at it from brain development, we see that every day in brain development, the fluid is actually changing. And molecules or hormones or growth factors are actually secreted into the fluid to give information to the developing brain on what to do. Okay. So already from a purely biological, hormone, biomolecular perspective, absolutely, the fluid is transmitting information. Something gets released into the fluid, whatever that something is, right? Something gets released into the fluid, and it goes and a signal through the fluid goes to the developing brain and gives it information. It might give it information on its status. It might give it information on what to do, including things like, do I need to make new neurons? Do I need to make new brain cells because you're growing? And so we know that it does that. And the number of examples, there's so many examples of that. We know that the fluid transmits that information for sure. There's no question about that. Okay. There's a group that showed that the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid, so just the movement of the fluid, okay, was responsible for sending information to the brain tissue that told rats where the new olfactory bulb, the new olfactory neurons needed to go. So based on the movement of the fluid, which was forward, and up, the new neurons knew how to migrate, how to actually move within the tissue of the brain based on the pulsations of the fluid in the ventricle.
Wow.
Okay. So we know that, right? That has been shown. So now the fun part of research is always the exploratory part, right? Creating hypotheses and trying to test them in the lab and seeing. Now you ask the question, if we know that it transmits the information of a molecule in the fluid, whether that's melatonin or a growth factor during development, or some molecule after a stroke or something like that, or a brain injury. And we know that there are examples that have been studied that show that neurons actually are responding to the movement of the fluid. Well, now you can try to extrapolate, right? That's the next hypothesis. What else could this fluid actually be transmitting?
Right.
What other information, energy, whatever you want to call it, right? Whatever you want to call it, what else could this fluid actually be transmitting? That's, I think, where not only does the science part meet the spirituality, because a lot of people, including myself, had an experience of the cerebrospinal fluid prior to actually knowing what it was, and then led me to then go back and say, hey, what's
going
this
on?
fluid going on, right?
And
then I was able to actually go to the lab and test it out and say, whoa, this is actually really cool. There's much more here in this fluid than we know. So absolutely. So now from a purely scientific perspective, is if the fluid transmits information to the brain, well, there needs to be a receptor. There needs to be a receiver that we can measure. Remember, I'm talking about things that we can measure, right? We haven't gotten into the things that we can't measure or that we don't have the tools or the instruments to measure, that's a whole nother conversation. But let's just try to find the things that we can measure. So a receptor or a receiver on this side, if I send a message, if there is a receptor here, then we could say, oh, if there's a receptor, then maybe that information is actually being transferred to the brain. Okay, so we do know, for instance, just like I was mentioning, we do know that there are receptors for growth factors. Right. So that's one. We know that there are receptors for, we call mechanoreceptors. A mechanoreceptor is something that responds to mechanical movement, vibration, stress, anything like that. So there are mechanical receptors on the ventricle. And they've even found light receptors. So receptors that can detect light, okay, on the ventricles. And so now you have to say, okay, just purely from what we can measure, we have biological receptors. We have receptors that can respond to growth hormones and growth factors and et cetera, et cetera. We have mechanoreceptors that can respond to movement of the fluid and vibrations and stuff like that. And we have light receptors. Okay. So from that perspective, we know that, for instance, this fluid, if there's a receptor, then we can hypothesize that then this fluid does have the ability to transmit information regarding, but we know growth factors, hormones, chemicals, stuff like that. We know movement, frequencies, fluctuations of the fluid, and light. And so what else could it actually transmit? Right? What other receptors that we don't know, that we haven't studied, that we're not even aware of, are present? And just looking at it from that perspective, if the CSF could actually transmit all that information, now you're looking at this real incredible sort of fluid midline space that can transmit information that's purely biologic, that can be related to frequency or resonance, vibration, and light. And so that takes us down a few different hypotheses that we're trying to get funding to test to see, can we actually transmit information based on frequency and vibrations and things like that to the brain to actually affect consciousness, to affect behavior, to affect health, to affect whatever it might be.
It's amazing to me that we know this much, and what we know is fascinating. It's just mind-blowing.
It's
It's
mind-blowing. It's
mind-blowing.
totally mind-blowing,
It's
right?
crazy.
And that's what's so cool about it is we have this fluid, and we've probably been doing practices that we're not aware of. And that's the brilliance of some of the looking back at some of the ancient practices, whether it's breath work, whether it's pranayama breathing, whether it's sound baths or tuning forks,
Right.
Tibetan bowls, chanting, right? Humming, whatever these practices might be, dance, yoga, movement, meditation, whatever it might be, that is actually, it's not only affecting our physiology, like it might be affecting our heart rate and our blood pressure and our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, but it might actually be affecting the frequency, the resonance of the fluid that's actually in our body, in our spinal cord, in the middle of our spinal cord, right? In the middle of our brain, might actually be affecting that resonance that then is giving the brain information and is able to transmit that information to the brain and shift the resonance of, let's say, the tissue or the fluid in the tissue, that then the tissue will then respond. And that's a really subtle, it's very difficult to measure those sorts of things. And that's why we're trying to design instruments and research techniques that don't need to stick a probe into somebody's head to measure it. To be honest, we have talked to a number of neurosurgeons to see if we can get even access, for instance, to patients that unfortunately may actually have a probe in the middle of their ventricle because of a trauma or some sort of accident that they were involved in. Can we measure these really subtle fluctuations? Because we're looking at trying to measure it in the middle of the brain, in the fluid in the middle of the brain, and then seeing if we can alter those fluctuations in any way, and does that actually transmit then a certain signal to the brain? And so those are the sorts of things that we're looking at doing. It's such a sacred area and it's so protected that it's so hard to get to. So it's just a matter of really, I always say, hey, let's keep going with what we know. Let's keep going with some of the practices that we have, including various breathing practices, thinking about moving this fluid, thinking about opening up the fluid so that it cleans out the toxins in the brain, that we get this river and this lake to be well nourished, bathed, clean through the practices that we do, and just pay attention to the resonance that we're exposing ourselves to, the energy that we're exposing ourselves to that might actually be affecting this fluid, because we're probably going to discover these things in the next 20 to 30 years.
So I just got to break this down so I can understand it.
Yeah.
The lake that's in I don't know all the sciencey.
That's fine.
Sometimes that helps, right? Sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We want to get this out to as many people as possible. And so the more language that is used to describe it and people get it, the better it is.
So if it's an analogy, it helps me visualize and understand what's going on. So if we have a lake, what is that place that makes that fluid?
The main place is probably coming from the brain, as well as what's called the choroid plexus.
That's the one.
The choroid plexus is that's the main organ, let's say, that makes the fluid.
Okay. And so you talk about the cilia. I've heard you talk about that, which is like the antenna, right?
Yes.
So are we receiving information from the energy field into that fluid, and then that's like communicating with our body, or is it just
absolutely
that's what's going on?
So that's an excellent hypothesis.
Okay. That's what I feel is going on, because that's what I felt happened to me. So I'm like trying to understand it. So I'll tell you what happened when I discovered your work is that I have a subscription to Gaia, which I watch like every day. And if people don't know what Gaia is, it's a great spiritual and science and a lot of what we're talking about. So I stumbled upon a show that I've never seen before. it was Veda Austin talking about the secret of water, which I'm like totally fascinated with. I ended up getting on, now I'm like down the rabbit hole, right? I ended up getting on YouTube and I found a lecture of yours. And you talked about Veda Austin in the lecture. This is in the same day. So I'm like, how is that happening that I'm seeing this on TV, which I've never seen before? I hadn't even known her research or anything about her. And then, boom, I happened to pick like the probability and that I would click on your video on the same day and you happen to be talking about her and her science. And I just watched this and I wrote these questions. I was like, oh my gosh, I have to ask him, like, how is that happening? Do we know?
Yes, we do know,
Okay.
I would say, because I think when you get into that, just talking about the conscious creative.
Yeah.
So from my experience, for instance, people call them, I don't know, you might call them miracles, you might call them synchronicity, whatever it might be. I think when there's a certain resonance that's manifesting, that's emitting, then there is going to be, it's just an energy
Right.
attraction. And so if there's an energy that you're resonating at, right? And so this is why I go back to the fluid again, is that whatever made you turn on that show, that's a very different energy that your body is going to, you're talking about a receiver, that your body's going to get, say, compared to watching Fox News or something like
Right.
that. And so now all your cells are listening. Your entire water system in you is resonating to that frequency.
Okay.
Okay. And from my perspective, it's asking yourself, even consciously, what is the frequency that I would like to resonate? If I want to resonate at love,
Right.
what can I actually do? What do I need to expose myself to? What do I need to expose my body to, my mind, my water? Just looking at myself as a totally non-judgmental, depersonalized energy field, right? That there's a bit of like conscious movement in here. Like, where do I want to move myself to? What are the things that I want to listen? Because that's another energy that's coming at me, right? What are the language that I want to use?
What radio station am I on?
Exactly. What radio station am I on? What am I listening to? And then what am I emitting?
Right.
Because we're all emitting. And at that point, I think if you're just resonating at that's what you're gonna find, and that's what you are going to attract at that moment. And that might come and go. You have the ability to change that at will.
Right. I think that leads so perfectly for myself over the last kind of 6 months. I told you at the beginning, I had a Kundalini experience, like totally never researched chakras, never, I've had a spiritual life, but nothing. And I had this cerebral spinal fluid experience, and I wrote a book in 2 days after that happened. And I was like, what's going on that when we're tapping into this, it's allowing our real creativity to really manifest and really flow on such a higher level. And it really made me start looking at all these super creative people where it's Beyonce is the queen of everything, but she's using lights, she's using vibrations in her shows. And it's like, some people are doing it on purpose or not. How do we start to learn how to create our art, our films, our books, our writing, our music through a lens of consciousness, through a lens of love, what you're saying? And how do we cleanse that cerebral spinal fluid to our best of the ability so we can receive that rush of pure consciousness?
Totally. Brilliant question. And I think you actually, the way that you were describing it made it seem like it truly happened for you. And so that process, to me, it's really about getting out of the way. And the practice that I've actually used the cerebrospinal fluid, because I say the cerebrospinal fluid is a connection to the I am. Right. For me, is that sense of beingness that is manifest. So there is a manifestation that is occurring through us.
Right.
Now, how does that spark of creativity come? There was probably very little or no resistance.
Right.
You probably allowed it to come.
Yes.
Okay. And so a lot of people,
I was totally not in the space to write a book. Totally, that was not the intention at all. I just was
yeah,
like,
and it probably wasn't the right, probably from your perspective, it was like you probably had a million other things
I
to
was like, this
do.
is
And you're
weird,
like,
but
I'm just gonna,
totally.
this is just coming
Yeah.
through. And so that's it's from a purely like conscious creative perspective, the way that I see it as is, if most of us are living life as individual entities and perceiving ourselves as individual beings, totally separate and discordant, and it's almost as if you imagine like there's a huge ocean and we all think that we're the top of the wave, right? And we can be, right, but the top of the wave has already manifested.
Mm,
It's already up. And so you could be like, oh, I'm a 6 foot wave, I'm a 2 foot wave, oh, that sucks, I want to be a bigger wave. Oh,
right.
and then you can judge yourself against other waves and you'd be, oh, that guy's surfing me, I'm super cool. You could have whitewater on top of your wave. You can be pristine and clean and whatever. And there's going to be a million different waves out there, right? And most of us, I think, identify with there. And then once there's that manifestation already that's created, from my perspective, if we're just living at that level, it's difficult then to manifest something else.
Right.
So to me, it's actually about the practice of going within. First, taking our spotlights, our energy, our attention is always outward projecting. Right. And so for me, it's about actually taking these spotlights, taking our attention and bringing it in of introspection and relaxing the energy, allowing the attention to rest, resting our attention. And where does it rest? It rests on, if we can get to that point, and that's the practice, is resting that attention, because we're so used to externally, it's, I got my eyes, I got my hands, I got my ears, everything is external. Coming inside, coming internal, having that introspection, looking within and resting our attention. And so then where does it rest? I would call it awareness. It rests in awareness. It rests in pure awareness. And in that space of pure awareness, one could say consciousness, everything is possible. That's the ocean without the waves. Okay, so when you're at the bottom of the ocean, so imagine it as we're all hanging out here at the top of the waves, and it can be stormy or peaceful, right? And it can be cloudy or sunny, and I could identify with being a whitewater wave or a 6 foot wave or a 2 foot wave. But if you've ever gone scuba diving, right, you go down 60 feet or 100 feet, you can be at the bottom of the ocean, you have no idea what's going on at the top. It's just,
Isn't that interesting?
you could look up maybe and see it, but you're looking up at it and going, wow, look, it's super calm. Or you're looking up at it going, wow, look at the waves up there, it's amazing. But what are you doing? You're sitting on the bottom of the ocean. Totally, you're a witness, you're pure awareness, bottom of the ocean. And that's actually, that attention, that analogy is that directing, almost like we have this sort of microscopic ability with our attention to go in and zoom in on something, to go in and ride the wave if we want to, but also to drop down and go to the bottom, put a 60 feet, 100 feet, and rest and witness and see it all happening. And it doesn't matter if it's cloudy, it doesn't matter if it's stormy, it doesn't matter if it's raining, it doesn't matter if it's sunny, it doesn't matter if the waves are 6 feet or 2 feet. We're down there at the bottom of the ocean looking up, and we can see it all happen.
Yeah.
And you can look up, and if you've never done this, and if you do scuba dive, I highly recommend it, because it's a really good practice. And I think it's very resemblant of a practice of attention, how we're choosing to direct our attention. And what I call that, what many people have called that, whether it's pure awareness, whether it's source, whether it's whatever you want to call it, consciousness, that is what we call the plane of possibility. That is, if from a biological perspective, that would be called totipotency, where everything is possible.
Wow.
Total potential, right? Total potential, not potential, total potential. And that's why in some of my lectures, you'll see I go back to embryology, because there was a period in all of our developments that our cells that made all of us were totipotent, had the potential to be everything. I could take out that cell, and that cell could create an entire new human being.
Wow.
There was a time when in my development, I had that capacity, right? Now I have cells that are more pluripotent and fully differentiated.
Okay.
But that's the same thing that's happening with our awareness as well. Pluripotent means I'm not completely totipotent. I can become some cells, but not all of them. Okay, so I can differentiate into some cells, but not all of them. So in that pure space of awareness, at the bottom of the ocean, anything is possible. The plane of possibility is there.
Wow.
Now, right? So that's totipotency, total potential. Now, we allow ourselves to just be, and we see what emerges, what comes,
Right.
what arises, and we could watch that too, right? We could see it go. You could let a little bubble out and watch it go all the way to the stream and say, do you want to follow that bubble?
That's interesting.
Do you want to go up to the top with that bubble? Because you could.
You can, or you cannot.
Or you cannot, right? And then it's, oh, hey, that was cool. That was neat. You know what? I'm just going to chill here for a little bit longer. Okay. And to me, that sense, and this is where that a little bit of like preparatory work may help. For instance, in terms of new emotions may arise from there. We don't get, a lot of good meditation or mindfulness or dealing with trauma. There might be trauma things that come up, whatever that might be. There might be an activation of the nervous system. And so that's why, from my perspective, before getting to there, it's really important to try to set yourself up so that you can rest in that space with peace and calm, and not have to be activated or deactivated by certain, oh my goodness, I had that memory of what happened to me 10 years ago or something. That's going to take us out.
Right.
That's going to be all of a sudden, boom, you're at the top, and now you're in the waves all of a sudden. Right? No, oh yeah, okay, boom. And so that's why getting to that place takes a little bit of
that. I feel like is very much to the point. You talk a lot about, and this is the space that I'm personally in, is like, who am I? Up until this point, it's I'm a singer, I'm a writer, I'm a this. But it's like when we rest and we observe, it's I'm not the bubble. It's just that's the bubble. I'm here. And so I think, especially as creatives, which everybody is creative, we're all creating everything. But I think in general, we become so attached to our art because it feels like who we are, that then there's not a flow of what the actual consciousness coming into manifestation is. There's a lot of toxins that has to be flushed out. Maybe you're getting a stack of mail instead of this is the mission. And instead of observing, like, I think that's where I'm at personally. And I think for creative people, learning how do we be unattached from, because I heard you say in another lecture about, does it matter what happens? And the answer is not really. We're here to experience that. We're here to see that. We're here to let that flow and say, oh, I wrote a book. That's cool. Like just letting that, and the more I become detached from those pieces, my art has to look like this and be like this and this. No, what is that? What is the universe? What is the energy field manifesting through me when I just relax and observe?
Exactly. With no resistance at all, right? With just what is emerging. And the only thing that I would add in that would be, there is a bit of, this is where the conscious manifestation I think comes through, is what's just like how you started this podcast, for instance. What's the intention? Can you inform creation with an intention?
Ooh, that's good. That's good, because I think
right?
that with
So
creative
now
people,
it,
they're not even setting an intention when they go to create. So it's just throwing stuff at the wall and hoping it becomes art.
so drop to pure awareness.
Mm.
From that space of pure awareness, set an intention for manifestation, and then let that go too. Right? Let any attachment to any outcome of that intention, let that go. And then watch. Just watch. See what happens. And now people say, how long am I going to? There's no linear, we're not in a linear time frame, right? Just like you're talking about, 2 days is insane to write a book, but it happened. Somebody would be like, a year ago, if I would be like, you know, on November, you're going to write a book today. You'd be like, I'm doing this.
Not
No.
a thing.
So we're not on a, you can't look at it as on a linear time frame. And so to me then, and you talked about it in this flow, right, is then that constant. And to me, it's a constant of dropping into the pure self, dropping into that pure awareness, spending time with yourself, and having a relationship now where there's manifest, unmanifest. And this is a two-way highway. Manifest, unmanifest. Because just like the wave, that's not separate from the water molecule that you're sitting in right down here at the bottom.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no, so if you see it just as like an energy, that it almost like a differentiated energy pattern. Okay. But it's the same energy.
Right.
So now it's, oh, I'm taking the electromagnetic spectrum and now I'm tuning it to be able to see the visual spectrum that we can say, oh, red, orange, yellow, green. But that's the same, red is the same energy as purple. It's just the wavelength changes a little bit.
Interesting.
Right? So it's not anything different. We see it as different, but from an energetic perspective, it's just the wave just goes a little faster.
Wow, that's interesting way to look at it.
And so from pure awareness, it's not different. There's no difference. That's where, in my experience, the sense of then the manifestation is the same as the creation. It's all one. Oh. So now you're having this relationship, right? Because it is all one.
Wow.
And you're like, okay. So then it's your choice. Where do you want to rest?
So as creative people, or people in general, because we're all creative, should we be sending more of an intention to create something, like, for example, this podcast, this series, the intention is to just offer information to people and practical applications to tap into that and all the steps you're doing. But should we be focused more on the intention of sharing that information rather than, I'm going to make a podcast, I'm going to make a film? Or do we need to be specific? Like, where is that? Or is it a dance?
Definitely say it's more of a dance, but the more specific you are, in my opinion, the more specific you are. But again, when we're more specific, then we tend to attach to it.
Right. So it's being specific enough that you can still say it.
And you're like, and then I'm going to let it go.
Okay.
Or some people could be, and I think that might be a little bit of just also tapping into yourself, being like, oh, I would like to be a little specific here.
Right.
Or it could be more general.
Right.
Okay. You could say, oh, let me live with love. What does that look like? Yeah. If you just leave it like that, it might be surprising what it looks right to you from a manifested perspective. And I think that's where in a lot of my discussions or stuff, I always say we are an N of one. And so it's actually doing those sorts of things for yourself and seeing how it works out. This and how did this work out? Or I tried this and how did this work out? And I tried that and how did that work out? Right. With my, when I was practicing this, the reason why I connect this to the cerebrospinal fluid is that the energy that was coming through the fluid was super powerful for me when I connected with the fluid. It was through the fluid that allowed me to have this sense of embodiment of a differentiated body, but also it was through the fluid that this energy was coming through. And so it was like through the fluid that I could get to the unmanifest
Okay.
from a physical perspective as well. And so that's why I bring it back to the fluid, because we could pay attention, for instance, to the fluid. And a lot of people, after I've talked to them or they've experienced it, call it a bridge, a conduit,
Yes.
some sort of bridge. And that's spot on, is that as we connect in, it's almost as if this conduit opens up, and it's already there. It's just now we're aware of it. We're aware of it, and we can have a more conscious relationship with. And so that's where, to me, it really becomes manifest, physical, mental, spiritual, unmanifest, physical, mental, spiritual, and how you can continuously have this two-way relationship, which your physical, your embodiment is informing the unmanifest, and the unmanifest is informing the man, and this constant sort of communication. And it goes back to that movement, right? We want to keep this fluid moving. We want to keep this fluid fresh. We want to keep that river flowing. We want to keep these lakes clean, whatever that might be. And so that again comes back to the practice of actually using the cerebrospinal fluid in this practice.
Conscious creating. That's perfect, because it leads me to the question of, when we're like, something I often say all the time is, and I'm sure you can speak on this, you don't go to a meditation retreat and then you're done. You don't, like, for me, tapping into this higher consciousness, it's every day. Like, to me, you have to cleanse that cerebral spinal fluid every day, right? We have to cleanse the toxins every day. Is that right? And it's
Yes.
it's like a reset. Once we wake up,
Yes.
gotta go again.
Yes.
Okay. So we need
Absolutely.
to be meditating. We need to be moving. We need to do it. Needs to be a part of our every single day in order for us to
Yes.
really create a life, moving in a different level. And
Exactly.
my question on that is, like, I'm fascinated by, you said this in another talk. You said something about, people think it's weird or something like that. And it's like, why are we so worried about what other people are perceiving or judging us, or, they might think it's weird that we do a dance or do a meditation every day? Why are we so concerned about that?
No idea.
It's like, it feels like if we could move past that, everybody's keeping up with the Joneses and it's, if we can move past that as a society, as a human race, like, so much could be, cleared. And
wouldn't it?
Yeah, how do we do that?
Totally. We all go to the bottom of the ocean.
That's so beautiful and perfect. Seriously.
I mean, at that point, and there's no waves that are affecting it. I'm not riding the 6-foot wave, and you're on the 2-foot wave.
We all go
right?
to the bottom of
Because
the ocean.
that's my Honda Civic to your Mercedes, or whatever you want to call it. And so if we're all at the bottom of the ocean and we're all relating to each other from that level, which is from that level of pure awareness, then that's it. Then that's the level of relation. And we understand that there is manifestation, but there's also the unmanifest. There's also that level of pure awareness.
I love that. That's such a simple answer, but that's the answer.
Yeah.
Conversations like this, and we utilize things like the internet and reach as many people in the hopes to elevate consciousness. And that's really the goal of why we're here. Wow, that's so beautiful. I feel like that's a good stopping place, even though we could talk forever and ever. Thank you so much for your time. I think your work is so valuable and so important. It's really the leading edge of science and spirituality. And I think, like, exactly what you just said, if we can make it more digestible and we can understand it more, and more vocabulary around it, more conversations, I think we'll open up a space where people can just start to create whatever they're creating, right? It's like just creating your life or creating. A lot of people, I think there's this next wave of creators, because once you tap into that, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, I'm not creative." And I'm like, "Yes, you are. Just because you don't sing or dance or paint, you're creative. That's where you come from. So, like, you are. And the more we go to the bottom, the more we can create, I think."
Totally. And try it out, right? Have fun.
Totally.
Like something comes up and you're like, oh, people are going to think that's do
Do
it.
it.
Just do it.
Totally.
Get it out there,
Totally.
right? Do that. Have that first, whatever that is, and put it on your, there it is. There's my clay piece. And then see what happens from that,
Yeah.
right? Because that creation then informs new creation and keeps on forming. And there's a feed forward process in this.
So beautiful. Is there any practices that you want to leave us with? I'm so big on practical application. How does somebody watch this and say, "I'm going to change my life using this information"? Is there any specific practices or anything that you want to leave people with?
Yeah, to me, it's really about that introspection. So any introspective practice that you have, whatever's authentic for you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a YouTube channel, Mauro Zapatera, and then I also did a 24 session program with the Emerging Sciences
Oh,
Foundation,
wow.
and it's all free. It's all on YouTube. It's called Awakening Awareness. That takes you through a very basic sort of finding a resource, setting an anchor, very mindful tools to deal with strong emotions or sensations that arise during meditation, and then actually goes through embryologically creation and gets to that point of connecting with the cerebrospinal fluid. It's 24 sessions. There's a little lecture at the beginning and then a practice afterwards. They've split it up. It's called the Awakening Awareness Program.
Amazing. I haven't seen it, but I'm definitely going to check it out after this. I'm going to link all of that into the description. I'm going to link all of his books into the description, everything that you've written. I love that you're writing children's books. I think the younger we start this, the less they have to sift through, and that's how we elevate. I'm also going to link my book. It's called The Mindful Creative. It will be linked in the description as well. It's also free for download, and just really tapping into these conversations and practices about how we can elevate our consciousness and create from a deeper space that's really manifesting this amazing, mind-blowing energy field that we get to be a part of. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you. And I'm sure we'll have more conversations in the future on conscious creativity.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, thank you so much.